Let's talk about Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is my fourth read of the Rings trilogy. I finished Fellowship the other day, and I'll start Two Towers soon. I haven't reread The Hobbit this time. I do want to read, if I can, the Silmarillion this year, or reread it. That would actually be, I think, my first full reread of the Silmarillion. I've read this once a decade, pretty much. And what can I say? It's my favourite book, The Lord of the Rings, or pretty much my favourite book at least, and I think it's a great book. So what can I say other than, well, it's the most famous fantasy book of all time, pretty much. I like it a lot and you should read it. I think what might be useful is to kind of talk a bit about the experience of rereading and rereading over that time, and how I think a big thing that came away from, for me, the third time I read it, so my second reread, was that I realised that Tolkien was a much better prose stylist than I'd remembered or realised when I was younger. And I thought, man, this guy can really write. I hadn't really thought he'd write. I thought he was okay, but I don't know if I'd found him dry, but I'd certainly found it more anonymous or less interesting. And I realised that simply wasn't fair or true. Like, he really is a very good writer, and that what's going on, in the book in terms of stylistically is intentional and clever. And I'd recognise some stuff about the structure of the book as well, the ways in which things like the Shire and Tom Bombadil are used, particularly some kind of famously cut from the movies bits, i.e. the whole Tom Bombadil section and the scouring of the Shire cut from the movie, which I think I understand, particularly Tom Bombadil thing being cut, but they're both incredibly schematically, programmatically important, and really satisfying for me. This read, what have I found? Well, I haven't found that I suddenly realised the prose is so much better than I remember, though it is very good. I haven't realised suddenly that there's a point to this Tom Bombadil stuff. I'd always enjoyed that stuff, but I hadn't really thought about it structurally before. And so what is it that I find this time? What has been added to the sense of this epic story with all these layers, all these subtales, all these wonderful famous moments? I think the big thing, a couple of big things. One, let's say the depth of world building. Two, the depth of characterization. And three, a certain. It is a structural point. It's hard to define, but it's really about not just what he pays attention to in terms of well, this must be important, but kind of just realizing in detail exactly what he pays attention to in details and what he doesn't detail. I think it's so much more interesting than perhaps people give it credit. World building, that seems obvious. He's famous for being the best world builder ever at some level, and how obsessive and deep into the world he was. And it's a cliche, but it's important to say perhaps just how much this pays off. The world feels deep because it is deep, and it is something that spawned tens of thousands of poor imitations. And I was struck while thinking about this that it is not a coincidence that the two most artistically successful post-Tolkien, Tolkien-inspired Tolkienia, i.e. not Shannara, but the Thomas Covenant Chronicles by Stephen R. Donaldson and The Dark Tower by Stephen King, are both, they cheat at world building. I don't mean they pretend that they have done world building when they haven't. Like with snatches of languages that haven't been built and the like. I rather mean that they do this other thing where they gesture towards a world and leave it so general and mysterious and beautifully phrased that it feels like it's much deeper than in fact one suspects it is. And what I think is interesting there is that they imitate the effect of Tolkien in a way that those who attempt to replicate Tolkien's method cannot, often fail to replicate any of the effect. Now, the one thing to say about The Dark Tower, which is one of my favourite series, and Thomas Covenant, which I really respect, is that neither is anywhere near as successful as this, as Lord of the Rings, as Fellowship. Here, you have, at every turn, especially once they're out of the Shire, but even in the Shire, the fact you get all the stuff referred to, which at some level, yes, Tolkien was kind of just adding as he went, but as it's polished, you realise it comes together. Like who are the big folk who are coming up from the south who might bother on the South Farthing border? how that fits into everything else you find out about those vast trackless areas to the south in Minhiriath and the Enedwaith, these big regions on the map where very few people live. The ways in, who are the Southrons who aren't the Southron spy in Bree, all these things where there are small things that either point towards the wider issue, the War of the Ring, the things that are happening and arising, or are pointers towards a wider world. I mean, examples of that being the explanation of the Barrow. The Barrow Wights are one. They are burial grounds of the princes of Cardolan. Two, they were, you read if you were in an appendix, they were a kind of refuge during the wars against Angmar for the people of Cardolan. But three, now, they're not, the Barrow Wights are not zombies of these princes. They're actually evil spirits of Sauron inhabiting bodies, using, if you like, the memories of those people, but not because the people have cosmologically gone beyond the circles of the world. All these things add in, and you realise that even in these relatively minor moments, there's so much depth and texture. And so, yeah, in a sense, that's cliched or, obvious, but it's worth repeating because every page is full of things. There is a digestion issue sometimes, not because he's putting out too many, he's not expositing stuff or dumping stuff, but just because the world is so rich. It's very much like, going out into the countryside and being overwhelmed by how many things and how much beauty there is. The second point, the depth of characterization, this actually maybe is the biggest surprise for me. Because I don't think last time I'd come away thinking, what a wonderful characterizer. Famously, Frodo and Sam, that's good character work. But actually, in general, he draws the characters very well. I think in general, I'd always thought he drew the Hobbits well. You always notice that Pippin, who is underage, who's not an adult functionally, he's 16, 17, 18. If you see adulthood as 21, he's certainly not 21. He's under that. If he's I don't know. But he always seems young, and it comes up again and again, including with Elrond saying he doesn't want Pippin to go on the quest. Merry is always functionally the leader in terms of practical things, the leader of the Hobbits. And he's not the oldest, but that does fit his social background and his personality. Sam and Frodo similarly in a much broader, deeper way, really. But I also noticed this time that, if you put it this way, one thing you could say about the films, one of the many strengths of the adaptations, is the way in which they draw out certain character notes which seem to latent or lacking, people would say, in the books. But so far, what I generally find is how much even the additions or expansions in the films are very much drawing on the books. So, for instance, Aragorn, he never explicitly doubts himself as king. He does doubt himself as Gandalf's successor in leading the company and in leading the Fellowship, and that is certainly drawn out. And you can see there is this question of, does he believe he can do this job in general? And there are even hints that he has to develop or come into his own as Elessar, the Elfstone. An example being that when they come through the Argonath on their journey south, the big statues of the kings, suddenly Aragorn looks different because he looks at his ancestors, Isildur and Anarion, and he feels heartened. He feels like he knows. And it's something which actually feeds into the fact he increasingly wants to go to Gondor, but doesn't want to abandon Frodo and Frodo's quest. So yeah, I think that there's this depth of characterization which is sometimes subtle, and sometimes you can see why in a cinematic context it needed to be expanded to really work. But it's not that Tolkien doesn't write characters; he just writes wonderful world and interesting story. It's actually that all these characters, Gandalf is a very good example too of multi-layered character work, and it is a moment really well represented in the films. That there's this the epitaph where Frodo comes up with some verses to remember Gandalf by, about all these things about him, and then Sam adds the thing about his fireworks, and you might think, well, Sam's being frivolous, but no, as the film presents, as in the book originally, it's a sincere thing where Sam's character, his personality, Frodo's personality and character, and Gandalf's character are all represented in this exchange of verses over Gandalf's death. Spoiler, if you haven't seen the now 21-year-old film. But you get the point I'm making, that all these things interact and connect and strengthen each other and are subtle. Tolkien will occasionally say, because the character was like this, but much more often he does actually he does show not tell. And in that case, you see that Frodo is this very sober, thoughtful chap, and Gandalf is this odd mixture of wisdom and wonder and joy. And in fact, his joy is what preserves him in a way it does not preserve Saruman, it does not preserve Curufin. I think is it Curufin, is that, or is it Curunir? You can correct me in the comments. It doesn't preserve his brother because he was much too serious. Gandalf's joy in the world protects him, and in fact a similar innocence and pleasure in the world protects Radagast from corruption. That's the point that Gandalf makes about what he thinks about Radagast, and Saruman's implication that he's corrupted Radagast as well in the Order of Wizards. You get that about Gandalf, and you get that Sam, he's not frivolous that he enjoys the fireworks, but he has an earnest respect and pleasure for the craftsmanship and the beauty and the joy and wonder, which will bear him through to the end of the whole story. You see Boromir is genuinely characterised well. One interesting thing, and this does come out again in the film, but is how Boromir is presented as basically, he's not short, but he's very stocky, he's very strong. So is Aragorn, but Aragorn is lithe. Boromir is strong. He is a picture, in a way, of Gondor. In a way, where you might say, well, Aragorn is this kind of slightly gaunt, weather-stained figure, much like the Northern House, whereas Boromir represents the South. But then Boromir's temptation is also drawn out over time, really interestingly. And there are character moments which are very powerful here. And again, compared to powerful moments in the films, are more powerful here. I know I'm making the comparison regularly, but because I'm so often thinking there is actually an authoritative, really excellent adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, not of The Hobbit, but of The Lord of the Rings out there. And when you look at how that kind of interprets the material and the depth, and it's incredibly impressive. But it is something where the famous moment of Frodo accepting the burden of the ring at the Council of Elrond, very powerful here, and much more lonely and much more ironically cinematic. Or again, Gimli, it's actually your authorial narrative description of Gimli suddenly feeling loved and cared for by Galadriel, which is very, very powerful, very, very moving. It is an incredible story. Finally, this is my kind of third point, is my je ne sais quoi point, wasn't it? That the things he cares about. Have you noticed, if you've read Tolkien, how little he talks about violence? You might say, no, there's constantly wars. This is about the War of the Ring. The Hobbit has the Battle of the Five Armies. The Silmarillion has the 5 great battles. One of them is called the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. Surely he's a violent writer, but actually, virtually nothing he writes in a whole book. And I'm thinking about having fairly recently reread the Battle of the Pelennor Fields on its own. There is so often, even in battle scenes, that very little about what he writes is action-based. Read Joe Abercrombie and read Tolkien next to each other. Some will see this as a criticism. I think it's really interesting, as in they'd say, well, I want good action scenes. Fair enough, whatever you like. But I think it's interesting that Tolkien, when he wants to write about a world falling into chaos, a world falling into war, he does not dwell on chaos and war. He is much more interested in people. He's much more interested in beauty and the loss of beauty. He's much more interior than we expect. It's one reason, I think, one of the many reasons the poetry in Tolkien matters so much. I've done a video about that, and I think it's worth watching. I hope, but more to the point, the issue of what the poetry does in Lord of the Rings is very important, I think. So I think, what he pays attention to. Why does he spend so long in the Shire? About a quarter of the Fellowship is in the Shire. Just under a quarter, or thereabout. No, about a quarter is in the Shire. In fact, if you can go into the Old Forest, the chapter of the Old Forest, chapter 6 of Book 1, they start in the Shire and then go into the Old Forest there. Yes, about a quarter. And when you think, that's so much, he is committing so much time and energy and effort to the place they're leaving. Is this not... And this comes up, I think, obviously in discussions of Eye of the World by Jordan, is how long they spend in their village. The reason is not simply... It's not a kind of structural trick because, oh, well, he's going to want to pay this off with the Scanning of the Shire. That's a really... I mean, I don't know if people say that. It feels like I've come across that sort of critique that really he spends so much time in the Shire because he's trying to build stuff up and trick us into caring. I think it's just that Tolkien cares. This is his home. It's his myth of England, right? The Lord of the Rings is his myth of the Anglo-Saxon peoples, of Britain to a degree, but particularly England and the Anglo-Saxon peoples. Well, lots of those in Scotland and Ireland and Wales, of course, as well. And I think he wants to present the world that they are defending, not because he thinks, well, you've got to get people to invest in this, but because he wants to, because it appeals to him, because it attracts him. And also, this is related, obviously, he genuinely thinks he needs to set up the stakes, he needs to set up what's going on there. And it's why the prologue concerning Hobbits, which is obviously fundamentally about the Shire, I'm counting as one of part of that section. Concerning Hobbits is not just meant to be a cute start, but is actually genuinely meant to make you think, there's this wonderful people called the Hobbits. It's 20 pages long, and it's they're wonderful people of the Shire. They live there. I really value them as the author. I'm passionate about them. They are my heroes, and they are the heroes of this tale. And this is the land they live in, and this is all the things that are valuable to them: the eating and the drinking and the family and the fellowship and the walking in the woods. That's one thing, is walking in the woods near south near Woody End or whatever, and over to Farmer Maggot's fields. All this depiction of rural England is not a structural trick. It is a genuine passion. Again, the long section, because then immediately afterwards you then get 3 chapters in Tom Bombadil. It is, in my edition, not till page 149 out of 411 or something. So you get nearly a third of the book is in the Shire or with Tom Bombadil, up to the Sign of the Prancing Pony, where you meet Strider and the world changes. And partly, of course, this was all written as one big book. So really, Tolkien is saying 15% of this book, or just under that, is spent setting it up, and the rest is spent paying it off. That is important to say. But within the context of the sub-story of the first 2 books, before the breaking of the Fellowship, which is a genuine narrative point, spike and turn, he is really attempting to kind of give texture and depth to the characters in the world, so that everything that happens afterwards matters, and he's willing to spend a lot of time on that. Again, the way in which he wants to present elves and magic, really interesting. What happens with Gildor and in the Shire. In fact, I'm thinking about they obviously they come across Gildor's trail again, but they meet him in the Shire, and he feeds them, and there's obviously magic that can preserve them through that one night, or they hope it can. And then you've got Glorfindel, and the fact that Glorfindel, when he glows, it is a spiritual light, not the Nazgûl are like, wow, that's a bit bright. Obviously, they don't like light and fire, but the way in which what is within Glorfindel is not a natural illumination, but a sort of spiritual power and light, which manifests as physical light. And Galadriel, you call it magic, she says. What you call magic, I would say is evil, but yes, you might call what I do magic. And it's partly to do with Nenya, and it's partly to do with her. Nenya preserves Lorien, basically, but the issue of the Mirror of Galadriel and the way in which she could use the One Ring, separate from Nenya, to basically be a dark and wonderful, beautiful queen, is in her. And it's because she, like Glorfindel, and I probably like Gildor too, I think, have seen, were in a man before, and in the Blessed Land before the exile. And so that kind of, he's interested in that, and he spends, that's 3 instances I can think of. Also the story, of course, around what's happening with Elrond and what is true of Rivendell is important and really interested me this time more than it has before. It also made me think in a nerdish way about what remains, who lives where and what are the population numbers, because I take it that Gondor presumably has hundreds of thousands of people. Rohan maybe not much short of that, probably into six figures. But then you've got places like the Enedwaith, which has all we know is there's a few fisher folk and presumably some Druidan or Pukul men as well, and then Minhiriath, maybe something similar. And Enedwaith has the Dunlandings as well. And you think, well, there's a few thousands or tens of thousands. But then really you go up to the Shire and you go up to Breeland. The Breeland really has actually a fairly small population, maybe 1,000, just over that. But the Shire, because you get some numbers of houses. I know this is boring to you, but the stuff I was picking up this time. But yeah, whereas the Shire presumably has tens of thousands of people in it. It's not enormously populated, but it is heavily populated. But what about the Elven Kingdoms? There are many of Elrond's councillors at the council, so there must still be a few hundred at Imladris. But that's really not very much. Again, at the Grey Havens and in Lindon, presumably a few thousand. The same in Lorien, some thousands. In Mirkwood, thousands, 10,000 perhaps. There are dwarves in the Blue Hills because they go backwards and forwards on the Great Road, and we know they're still there at that point. And there are dwarves in Erebor. We have some hint there are dwarves further east, of course, as well, but we're talking about what we know about. And you just get this picture of this world and the way he's envisioned this world, and the fact that those are things that even as half hints he drops, that it goes back to the world building point, but also that he really has this strong sense of this world and its populations, and how much they matter in a way that maybe does come across as nerdy, but which indicates his lots of things about his views of nations. So yeah, there were lots of things like that I picked up. I think I could probably add more. I think magic in general was interesting to me. The way that Amon Hen, Frodo can use that to see lots of things. What was there any other good examples of magic for me? There might have been some others. But yeah, I think just generally just kind of what's out there in the world. The journey in Moria interested me. I probably never really, maybe partly because of how dominant the film might be in my head, actually, if nothing else. But rereading Moria was really interesting to me, and is it Ori or Owen? I think it's Ori's flowing Elven script, not writing in Kurth, but writing in so not writing in the runes, but writing in Elven script. I massively enjoyed the reread, as I expected I would, but I think I took away so many more things that I haven't taken before, and found so much more depth. And it's something which made me think about the way in which age and reading, some things you reread and they don't last, obviously, but the fact that really great things get better, and that they always have more to offer, and the great books are deep books, not because they are Ulysses by James Joyce, where you kind of respect them, but and there's so much in them, but of course they're an artifice in the almost in the pejorative sense, perhaps. But rather, you read these great books, and you're always in Lewis's terms, and to misuse the phrase, in fact, but you're always able to go farther up, deeper in. You're always able to find more things going on and different layers of things going on, and this character does this in this way. And as I say, characterization was a big takeaway for me from this reread of Fellowship, is how strong the characterization is of so many characters in a way that I hadn't picked up previously. So yeah, I enormously enjoyed it. I would, of course, as I said already, recommend it. I think it is... actually, one final point. The economy of this book. The text, this is my second version of it, actually, because my first one is basically falling apart. The text is small but not minute. And one thing that struck me is the Fellowship, which is the longest of the three books by a reasonable margin. The Fellowship gets so much done, and you could say, well, it doesn't finish the story, does it? It's all those pages and it doesn't finish the story. It's, if you include the prologue, it's something like 70 pages longer than Two Towers, and 100 and something pages, 150 almost pages longer than Return. But yeah, it gets so much done in, relatively speaking, so short a period of time. it's one reason why the fact he spends so much time in the Shire. There's so much time in Lothlorien as well. Three chapters pretty much. Why that is significant is because when he wants to be efficient and quick, he will be, and he will quickly communicate information in a very effective way. He gets a lot. It is something where he gets a lot more done for the words than many very good modern fantasy authors would do, because I think there's a discipline of mind involved and a willingness to keep, as we know, editing and keep compressing and condensing. So yeah, I guess I will leave that there this time. What do you think of Fellowship of the Ring? Oh no, this is the point I was going to make. It is, I think, fantasy that will last. I don't think it's something which will last as a genre classic. It is a cultural classic, and I think it will last as a cultural classic when many other perfectly good books are no longer so. Like Harry Potter as an example. I think Lord of the Rings is genuinely a great novel. In the top 100 most significant novels in the English language kind of category, maybe in the top 50, on the top 25, there is a reason why it established fantasy not just as a viable genre, which fantasy and sci-fi already were, fantasy less so, but as a increasingly, once it was discovered in America in the 60s, as a prestige genre, is because it is as if you'd suddenly come across the Raphael's Holy Family, or I know the Brandenburg concertos or something, and you're like, oh, this is the first thing I've ever heard that's like this, or seen that's like this, and suddenly there's this work which is just a complete and perfect on its own terms work that shows you what this thing can do. As if you'd found the Saturn rockets and be like, wow, so this is space travel. So yeah, what do you think of Fellowship of the Ring? If you haven't read it, are you going to? When? What's been your appreciation of books over time? Like, as you grow older, as you gain a wider range of experience and ability and understanding, what ages well and what doesn't? Because I think that's a big feature of age and experiences, that you come back hopefully with better skills and better understanding to appreciate things. Those are some things I think would be good to talk about in the comments. Till next time.